So it's good. It's good to see so many people turning out. I think maybe our food's a little too good. Back off of that and serve saltine or something. Today we're continuing our series on hotspots. This is an augmentation of what we've done in the past with regard to the speakers. And I'm excited to be leading this one today with Ambassador Edmund Fitton-Brown. Ambassador Brown has a 33-year career in the Foreign Service in the United Kingdom. He was the ambassador to Yemen, and he then served for 5 years running the monitoring team that was monitoring the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. So he knows a bit about terrorism and counterterrorism. I would commend to you an article that made us decide to do this, that he wrote in the Countering Terrorism Center's journal, The Sentinel. It was published in September, and it's a very comprehensive article about the terrorism threat globally. The Counterterrorism Center is at West Point, which is also the home of the 16th ranked football team in the country right now, quarterbacked by Captain America. So we like what they do at West Point. I want to thank, before we get started, I want to thank the Intelligence Studies Project, which I'm a part of, the Clements Center, and the Strauss Center, which are the sponsors of these events. And without the support, we couldn't do this. Just a quick introduction from my perspective. After 9/11, I was a chief of station overseas when 9/11 happened, and I got very busy and was working sort of, it's not really 24/7, more like 18/7 most days. But about day 5, I sat down and wrote what I thought the lessons of 9/11 were. I'm going to tell you what they were, but it's literally like this long, and I have it in a box somewhere. I remember to throw it away because I was doing a lot of thinking about it. But one of the things I wrote down was that if someone declares war on you and says that their purpose of existence is to attack you, perhaps you should take that seriously. I think the Israelis looking at Hamas have made that same check on that point. And we were just discussing upstairs, we have folks in the world right now who have Death to America on their flag. So it is we do not get to choose when terrorists decide that they want to try to attack us. So we are now, I go back to that time period, it was about 1 or 2 years after a new administration came in. That new administration, like all new administrations, Dr. Shuri could tell a lot more about this than I can, had a set of priorities and policy goals they wanted to accomplish. And they were optimistically thinking that they could manage their way through that. Terrorism was not at the top of that list. The national security advisor they hired had a PhD in Russian studies. To put this in a non-academic way that I was taught in the military, the enemy gets a vote. And so what we're going to talk about today is whether or not we are sufficiently paying attention to the jihadi terrorist threat globally. I don't know if that's a good way to summarize it, but that's the way I'm going to summarize it. So what we'll do is the ambassador will speak to you for a few minutes, then I'm going to ask him a few questions. We'll move this podium out of the way, then we're going to take your questions. So Ambassador Fitton-Brown, thank you.
Just switch that on, so let me know if it's loud enough. I tend to speak a little quietly, and if I lapse during the talk and start to go down in volume to the point where it's a problem, let me know, please. Also, if I use jargon, I'm going to try to, but before I use a set of initials or something like that, I'll try to know what I'm talking about. But if at any point it goes so badly wrong that I'm talking about something and you think, I don't even know if that's in Uzbekistan or in, in Chad or something, then please put a hand up and say, what is that group that you're talking about? I'd like to, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's really great to see people. And of course, thanks to Paul, thanks to all of Paul's colleagues, and the Intelligence Studies Project of the Clements and Strauss Centers, the LBJ School, the University of Texas in general. And I'm thanking really for the welcome that I've received since I moved to Austin just over 2 years ago. The enjoyment, intellectual stimulation, and professional value that I've derived from regular attendance at events like this have been really important to me. And so, I was also here for the first hotspot briefing, which was a few weeks ago on northeastern Africa and tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia. If I could be half as informative to you as the two speakers then were, I should be more than satisfied. I wonder about this hotspot term. I mean, it's quite a good one for terrorism, but there's no particular spot I'm going to be talking about. This is going to be fairly wide-ranging. I should also observe that it's a privilege to brief you at a time when we're all preparing for a new incoming US administration. Regardless of your politics, this is an important moment to inform and shape the US approach to key national and international security challenges in the months and the years ahead. It must be an exciting time for anyone studying these issues right here and now. Now, you're aware of my background, so I won't dwell on it, but suffice it to say, I have experience as a CT practitioner, analyst, policy advisor, and advocate from my time as a British official, the United Nations coordinator, and now as a counter-extremism project advisor. Within the bounds of the rules of confidentiality, I will be happy to go into more detail about my experience if you ask me to during the questions and answers. Now, the topic of this talk, the global jihadi threat that we still face going into 2025, is one that I was honored to address, as Paul said earlier, in the West Point Combating Terrorism Centre Sentinel article, which was actually published on the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. So I was sensible of that responsibility and that honour. It was a privilege to write that. I tried to obtain hard copies to distribute. Unfortunately, as is the way with publications these days, it was available online on the 11th of September. It was only published in hard copy last Wednesday, and my allocation of copies is still in the mail on its way from West Point to Austin. But it's easy, it is readily accessible online if people would like to look at it. Right? No, indeed. And so I'll draw on the article, and the idea is to spark some questions. And I know Paul has plenty of questions that he will start with, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. And I think it's the discussion, it's that sort of interaction that often is the most valuable part of these events. I argue in the Sentinel article that the world has lived through two distinct phases of counterterrorism since 9/11. Essentially, the decade of Al-Qaeda and the decade of ISIS. And by the way, I may say AQ rather than Al-Qaeda from now on, so just to be clear. And you could say the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 makes a sort of a convenient divider between the two, although obviously very imprecise. And if you're looking for a similar sort of bookend in 2021 leading into the new phase that we're in, that would be the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Now, on September the 11th, 2001, I had just returned from a posting to Kuwait and had just begun a new Middle East focused job in London. But I think it was immediately apparent, even on the day itself, to all of us, that the world had changed. And I wasn't surprised to be drafted into the response. I deployed to Afghanistan for a while in January 2002. While we're on history, and here we are now at the moment talking about something that happened 24 years ago, just over 23 years ago, I don't want to get into the detail of the history. You know the history. I'm sure you've either lived it or read it. But what I will do is try to draw a few conclusions from that history. So keeping it very brief as we come up towards the present day. CT work changed after 9/11. It was ramped up to a scale not seen before. There was counterterrorism before, but 9/11 really did move it to a completely different level. It became the priority in national security in the United States, the priority in international security. And it was not just about chasing down the perpetrators and the enablers of 9/11, bringing Al-Qaeda to justice, expelling the Taliban from power in Afghanistan. It was also about obviously preventing future attacks. And in the process, lessons were learned about how to do CT better, more forcefully. Huge resources were diverted to what became, in many cases, sustained counterinsurgency campaigns. Technology was brought to bear, including drones, related geolocation of targets. We also learned lessons about the importance of legal compliance in counterterrorism, and that's something that I can return to if people are interested. It was a big part of what the United Nations was concerned with. Burden sharing with foreign partners became easier because of the widespread revulsion felt at Al-Qaeda and sympathy with the United States. Previously reluctant CT partners, especially in the Middle East, were obliged to help. I was posted in Egypt before 9/11 and then again in Egypt after 9/11. And although those postings were just a few years apart, it was really striking how much the whole pH of counterterrorism had changed in Egypt over a period. Now, of course, we saw many Al-Qaeda attacks in the decade that followed, and some of them extremely serious, including in London, including in Madrid and elsewhere. But there were also major counterterrorism successes. And of course, counterterrorism successes are never as visible as attacks. And that sort of, that notion, a bit like the goalkeeper, you know, if you make one mistake, then everyone knows. Whereas however many saves you make, you may not get quite the credit that you should. But there was this huge increase in the effectiveness of counterterrorism. And the attritional pressure on Al-Qaeda progressively degraded that threat and continued to degrade it into the teen years. Of course, the killing of bin Laden wasn't the end of the story. Al-Qaeda faded over time, but its renegade branch in Iraq continued to mutate into what we now think of as ISIS. And we were then faced with the explosion of ISIS onto the global scene in the form of the so-called caliphate. And the sort of conditions for that to happen in Iraq and Syria already existed in Iraq because of the sort of catastrophic aftermath of the 2003 invasion, the failure to stabilize the country. And in Syria, of course, we're now talking about the era after the Arab Spring and the chaos that caused inside Syria and the progressive polarization of the Syrians between those who were trying to hold on to Assad and those who wanted to change, but were increasingly forced to side with Islamist groups. It's hard to imagine it now, but a decade or so ago, in large parts of Iraq and Syria, this became an inspiration, a draw for Islamic extremists around the world. This realization of a quasi-state was something new, and the migration of tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters to join the caliphate was, in its own way, as seismic an event as 9/11 had been. I'll just come momentarily up to date to say here that most of those foreign terrorist fighters and many of their dependents, including children, are still alive. And we forget them at our peril because there is an acute security issue here, quite apart from the humanitarian and legal issue around people being stranded in no jurisdiction. Some of these foreign fighters or foreign supporters of the caliphate returned home, and in some cases they faced judicial processes. Some of them have served prison sentences. Some relocated elsewhere. Some are still stuck in the region. Some of them are at large in the region, and some of them are in holding facilities that exist primarily in Syria. But of course, there are also people who are in sort of a limbo, displaced limbo in Iraq. And the point I want to make here is that this is a generational issue. In 2018, there was an Indonesian foreign terrorist fighter who was killed in Syria. And he had been a small child when his father participated in the first Bali bombing. And the point I'm making here is that if you have a 12-year-old right now in custody in Syria in complete limbo, being brutalized by ISIS rule in a camp like Al-Hol, the people dealing with counterterrorism tend to be officials on fixed-term postings. They might be doing 3 years, 5 years, or the people making the policies, the politicians, they might have electoral mandates that are 4 years long, or 5 years long, or 7 years long. But we have to be thinking about what that 12-year-old is going to be doing in 18 years. That is important because this will be a future multiplier of the threat. Now, like 9/11, the rise of ISIS through a determined international response to the group's unprecedented, gleeful brutality and also its challenge to the international order. Now, tomorrow marks the 9th anniversary of ISIS's Paris attacks that killed more than 100 people. And their last attack that was on that kind of, really big scale was in a non-conflict zone. And I always make a distinction between what is happening where you have an active conflict and where you have attacks that take place in places like France or the United States or Singapore or Japan or wherever it might be. What I call a non-conflict zone. And the last of those kind on that scale took place in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday in 2019. Gradually, the military defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq in 2017 and then in Syria in 2019, coupled with intense CT pressure in many other locations, ushered in what we have now, which is a present period of unusually low threat in non-conflict zones around the world. And that itself has been followed by some disinvestment in counterterrorism by Western governments. The very different strains of the COVID pandemic, which, by the way, also further suppressed the threat because it complicated terrorist travel and meeting arrangements. But this has led to further relative deprioritization of counterterrorism as economies and budgets suffered from the pandemic. And then, of course, rising strategic rivalries that we're all very conscious of these days, as well as transnational environmental issues like health and climate, came to the fore and demanded more resource. And there's an important lesson I want to draw out here, and that is a tendency, even in well-resourced, sophisticated states like the United States and the United Kingdom, to over-focus on the issue of the day, over-resourcing it, and then, when its urgency fades, over-correcting in the other direction. We are big enough and wealthy enough and should be wise enough to maintain coverage of all of these important issues. Now, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021 didn't fire as loud a warning shot as it should have done about future danger, future risk. And that's partly because the partisan Afghanistan discussion in Washington made it harder to have an honest debate, an honest lessons learned exercise. Because what you really want to do is to look at Afghanistan and neither being alarmed nor complacent, to say, where do we now stand? And I was recently at another ISP talk here, where Afghan General Sami Sadat eloquently reminded us all that Afghanistan is anything but settled business. I'm glad that the US election is over and Afghan policy can now be addressed on its merits, I hope. Then in 2022, the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine damaged international unity of purpose and terrorism. Before I left the UN, later that same year, I saw how previously harmonious Security Council discussions on CT became increasingly fraught and unproductive. The Gaza conflict and its regional ramifications have now further complicated that picture, with the UN becoming increasingly dysfunctional, frankly. And this matters in counterterrorism because the UN had taken on an important role in encouraging and facilitating the international burden sharing that I referred to earlier. And of course, I can say more about what the UN does in the field of CT if people are interested, but I won't I won't dwell on that now. All these conflicts undermine CT work in other ways. So already this year, we have seen attacks in Iran and Russia, on which the United States have elements of preemptive intelligence. Now, both of those attacks were carried out by ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province, or essentially the Afghanistan-based affiliate of ISIS. Now, of course, the US did absolutely the right thing, and it shared its intelligence with the Iranians and the Russians, because when you're talking about saving lives, you do that. But, of course, the Iranians and the Russians chose to ignore the warnings, and then when the attacks happened, they tried to blame them absurdly on their preferred scapegoats. In the case of Iran, they blamed Israel. In the case of Russia, they blamed Ukraine. And, you know, it's not, it should be fairly obvious that if you're in that sort of mindset, you're not going to do good counterterrorism, because your mind is not open to what's happening, you're not listening to the intelligence that's available, and then you're trying to put a political spin on what's happened rather than drawing honest lessons from it. Meanwhile, of course, the underlying factors that drive violent jihadi extremism are growing more acute. And the success of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in conflict zones, in generating safe havens in which they may be able to revive their external operational capability, that is a worry, and we should be concerned about it. It's worth a quick dive into these regional developments to trace the trajectory of the global threat, which since 2021, I would submit, has already risen somewhat, and it's likely to rise further. Now, many CT analysts, including those in the government here in Washington, DC, see ISKP, or ISIS Khorasan, ISIS Afghanistan, as the main short to medium term concern. And I think that's probably true. It's observably true that, that most of the recent serious terrorist attacks and attempts have had some kind of connection to ISKP. But there is a possibility of an even more serious threat incubating in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. And that is why it's so important to look at Afghanistan afresh and focus on the future and address the current and the evolving threat. The fact that Al-Qaeda and a range of other terrorist groups have safe haven in Afghanistan, and indeed the Al-Qaeda leader, Saif al-Adil, has called this year for extremists to migrate there, to resume the process of migrating to Afghanistan, which we remember from previous decades, should give us pause. The Taliban remain allied with these groups, especially with the Pakistani Taliban, or TTP. And the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, are complicit not just in the presence of these groups on Afghan soil and their ability to train and to organize, but in the case of TTP, they are directly complicit in cross-border terrorist activity in Pakistan. And Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan has been encouraged to assist and operate alongside TTP, just as it remains aligned with other ethnic extremist groups hostile to Afghanistan's other neighbors. And again, I won't go into the alphabet soup, but you know, Uzbek groups, Tajik groups, Uyghur groups, etc. Meanwhile, the international community is looking the other way, because some seek normalization with the Taliban for economic reasons or for reasons of political influence, and others want their help in containing ISKP. It is true that AQ-aligned groups don't pose a severe immediate threat in non-conflict zones, partly because of a lack of capability, and partly because Al-Qaeda's sponsors, like the Taliban and like the Islamic Republic of Iran, are cautious about being embarrassed and facing military consequences in the event of a major attack in the West being traced back to their soil. But the Taliban's default setting of using blackmail to get its way in international affairs and its intemperate reaction to any perceived slight against its ideology that occurs anywhere in the world makes it very clear that any Taliban restraint on al-Qaeda is temporary and conditional. Meanwhile, Pakistan's fragile democracy is the target of both the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. And although Pakistan's policies sometimes frustrate us in the international CT community, we will really know about it if that country falls to Islamic extremism. The Afghan Taliban have also inspired African terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Jainim, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin, which is a sort of an Al-Qaeda coalition in the Western Sahel of Africa, to seek power in their arenas. These people have looked at the Taliban, they've looked at their success in Afghanistan, and they've said, hey, we could do that. Shabaab have said, we could do that in Somalia. Jainim have said, we could do that in Mali, we could do that in Burkina Faso. Now, in view of the potential Afghanization of Somalia and the Western Sahel, we are likely to face more failed states in the future, and therefore more safe havens for terrorist groups, especially in Africa. In the medium to long term, this will inevitably manifest as a much higher terrorist threat globally. What goes on in the conflict zone doesn't stay in the conflict zone, and that is why our forward defences and our international partnerships are so vital. Moreover, this prognosis doesn't factor in the implications of a more active operational partnership between Iran and al-Qaeda, if that proves to be sustainable, but it is happening. With al-Qaeda global leader Saif al-Adil hosted in Tehran and apparently willing to set aside Sunni-Shia rivalry and include al-Qaeda in the Iran-led axis of resistance of extremist militias, we are already seeing practical cooperation between former rivals and adversaries. For example, in Yemen, the Houthis are no longer fighting against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Increasingly, they are deconflicting and even collaborating. And the Houthis even have the beginnings of a collaboration on weaponry, technology, other resources with al-Shabaab across the Red Sea in Somalia. In the event of a serious escalation between Israel and Iran, or indeed between the United States and the axis of resistance, we will face a wholly different threat landscape, especially in Europe, which is an easier target for infiltration and attack than North America. And I do want to emphasize that. I think North America sits a long way away from a lot of these conflicts and is more insulated from them, but not completely insulated from them. And of course, unlike in the early post-9/11 period that I referred to earlier, Russia, which is using Iranian drones in Ukraine, and in turn is supplying the Houthis with military technology and targeting information that has helped them to attack international shipping in the Red Sea, Russia will be firmly on the side of our adversaries. The numbers of European citizens who will be sympathetic to the Iranian side and hostile to any likely position adopted by the US, UK, NATO, and major European powers will mean that a diversity of threats motivated by hatred of Israel, hatred of the West, straightforward anti-Semitism, that diversity of threats supported by Iran and other malign state and quasi-state actors, and whipped up by the full range of jihadi propaganda by ISIS, al-Qaeda, and others, will proliferate. Potentially, this will test our counterterrorism and wider civil defense in Europe and ultimately in North America as well. As I've said, for now, the global jihadi threat away from conflict zones, and especially in the short term, is much lower than it was 10 years ago. It is predominantly improvised and opportunistic, knife or vehicle attacks with a very short flash to bang in terms of the radicalization of an angry lone actor online, as, for example, was the case in one recent case in Germany. That's the sort of model that we've seen a lot of in Europe recently. That's the sort of stuff that has been disrupted by European security services and counterterrorism agencies, certainly the case in the United Kingdom as well. Arson, hijacking, hacking, and vandalization of infrastructure are also other sort of possible scenarios in the short term. One of the things that we saw happen with the defeat of Islamic State in Iraq and then in Syria was that the ISIS gave up, wound up its external operational capability. It decided that to survive as a global franchise and to resurge at some future date, it had to give up on non-essential functions. It needed security, it needed political direction, it needed resourcing, logistics, it needed propaganda. It regarded all of those things as essential components for its survival. But it decided that for the short term, it didn't need its external operations capability, and that was wound up. And it's in the process of being rebuilt in various ways through a system of regional networks. Again, I can expand on that if people are interested, because the way that ISIS is structured these days is quite interesting in itself. But it's too long a subject for me to lead off with. But, you know, if we see external operations capability regenerated by ISIS and indeed possibly by Al Qaeda, then that will change the game. It will change the nature of these attacks. And instead of what we're seeing at the moment, which are generally inspired attacks, which people have come to because they've been spending too much time online, they've become radicalized, they've found instruction, certain types of websites, or some element of facilitation from like-minded people. The kind of attacks that we've seen 10 years ago, which were directed, complex international attacks, probably will make a return. And don't forget that there are the veterans of previous conflicts, especially alumni of the ISIS Caliphate, hardened jihadis with combat experience, who may at some point re-enter the fray. And you have the House of the Caliphate, which was a famous ISIS program where they were training young kids, and then even younger kids who've been, as I said earlier, have been sort of rotting in these camps in Syria. Add to that the potential multiplier effect of aligned state actors. In conclusion, the period since 2017 will likely come to be regarded as an exceptional one of calm and of exceptional security, a period when counterterrorism agencies had a clear upper hand over the threat. And unfortunately, it is difficult to see any means by which that period will be long extended. Instead, I think we will have to get used, as we have during previous periods, to more frequent and more serious attacks in non-conflict zones. And that is why, to sort of come back to that point I made earlier, which I know is something that I think Paul wants to talk about, a precipitous disinvestment in counter-terrorism would be a tragic political mistake in present circumstances. We do need to maintain our coverage across the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. In the context of the hotspot briefing, I think we can easily have a hotspot briefing on several of the places that you mentioned. It's not just interesting to foreign policy folks. It is some of these are changing sort of before our eyes. I'm thinking of North Africa as an example. But I have a lot of questions, and I'm not going to be able to ask them all because I want to leave time for your questions. But I think the most direct question I'd like to ask is, I'm going to do a little bit of a preamble to it, and that is that when we're not being attacked, there are multiple explanations for that. So one is that we've hardened the target. It's harder to do. It takes more planning. During that period you were talking about, that leading up to 2017, we got pretty good at penetrating those things. And as you said, we had successes that nobody heard about. I can remember I was a deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center, and we didn't sit around feeling sorry for ourselves about that, but the Bureau, would often literally arrest people that were on their way to conduct an attack, and it would sort of be, page 7 or something, for the same thing. So capability and hardening is one thing, intel penetration is another thing, but then also there are just decisions. Some of these groups want to attack, some don't want to attack. There were, within Al-Qaeda, there were strategic differences going all the way back to bin Laden's Zawahiri about whether to attack in the West or, near enemy, far enemy, that whole debate. And then there were major differences with ISIS. I was actually in Iraq when we discovered the letter from bin Laden to Zarqawi telling him to back off on some of the things he was doing, and Zarqawi pushing back on that. Which groups are more likely to want to conduct and see it as in their strategic advantage, sophisticated attacks in the West?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to leave aside groups like Hezbollah, the Axis of Resistance groups for the moment, because they are subject to different calculations. They really are entirely state-sponsored. These are groups that are proxies of Iran. So we'll leave that aside for another conversation. But when you're talking about the international jihadi groups, obviously the two biggest ones are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I think my conclusion is that ISIS is the greater threat in the short term, that the next big attack, wherever it may happen, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's Western Europe or somewhere else, is most likely to be done by ISIS. ISIS is a nihilist death cult. I mean, they are completely incautious. That exchange that you're referring to between bin Laden and Zarqawi, that was a really good example of this. Bin Laden was a strategic thinker.
Red Mao.
Yeah, exactly. And ISIS, Al-Qaeda have always been very critical of ISIS for their recklessness and the fact that they brought down the international coalition upon themselves. So they burned brightly and then they were extinguished, at least temporarily. But they still have that, both the recklessness and they have the superior propaganda operation. ISIS propaganda is better than Al-Qaeda propaganda. And they have still, there's a sort of they capture the imagination of the extremist community around the world in such a way that they're most likely to be the people who inspire. And of course, they have in ISKP probably the single most capable individual franchise of either group. So I think they're the immediate threat. But I think that Al-Qaeda, with its greater strategic awareness and with its focus on collapsing fragile jurisdictions in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, I think they are the longer term greater threat.
I think, I wasn't planning to ask this, but as a follow-up to that, because Al-Qaeda had a long-term plan and because bin Laden was in charge, they had a different culture. You were talking about this burning bright on the ISIS side. They had a different culture. They vetted people before they came in. They were more disciplined. You could sort of pull off planning a sophisticated, attack. Whereas ISIS was getting a lot of young people rushing, and they put them in the front line. They kind of vetted them by, if they didn't die, they might ask them to do something else. I guess my point is that we had kind of we were covering Al-Qaeda very carefully, and we were disrupting a series of threats after 9/11. I think I agree with you completely about the ISIS more likely to want to do it. But do you agree with me that the better at keeping it secret, if it wasn't a lone actor, if it was a sophisticated thing, it might be Al-Qaeda. What do you think? But just in terms of the way they operate.
Yeah, no, I do think that's entirely possible. I mean, I think, as I said, I think in the longer term, I see Al-Qaeda as the greater threat. Obviously, we had one very significant development in Al-Qaeda in recent years, and that was the US killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul in 2022. Now, that was a remarkable CT success for the Americans. It was a remarkable embarrassment for the Taliban. I think where it's really hard to gauge the impact is what is the difference between Al-Qaeda under Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda under Saif al-Adil. And of course, people used to say that Zawahiri's strategic patience was so patient but it was exhausting the organization, you know, that they weren't doing anything.
Maybe it was a bad idea to kill him.
Well, not going to go there, but if Saif al-Adil is more capable, and in particular, if he's able to bring off this idea of deconfliction with Iranian objectives, then Al-Qaeda may suddenly become a much greater threat.
Yeah, and I think the point I just wanted to make to the group, and I always make to my students, is don't confuse capability with intention. I mean, Zawahiri and bin Laden had the near enemy, far enemy debate. There was, you know, and so there's quite a bit of capability out there, I think. I want to talk a little bit about prevention. Like, you know, there's sort of like an upstream aspect of this problem, which has to do with ungoverned spaces, you know, and it might even be foreign policy issues related to state sponsorship. And then there's a downstream sort of staying one step ahead, you know, intelligence operations that give you tip off and warning, the ability to work with the coalition. And you're a little very explicitly worried about whether we, as you put it, taking our eye off the ball. What are things we should be doing to make sure that we're still prepared in those kind of downstream things? The upstream are very important in prevention, but in the direct prevention, what are you most worried about when you talk about the taking our eye off the ball?
Well, I mean, of course, there's just pure resourcing. So if you reduce the amount of effort you put into counterterrorism, that carries certain risks, and you have to try to offset it by being more efficient. Now, it may well be that we are becoming more efficient. You know, it may be that the technological lead that you have, particularly in the United States, is really helpful in that respect. The other side is burden sharing. It's having really good partnerships, because, you know, this is one of the real lessons after 9/11 was the way that the United States, especially, but, you know, others, were able to generate really powerful force multipliers in the conflict zones. And that sometimes took the form of vetted units, things of that kind.
Right.
But sometimes it was as basic as just having, you know, people like the Egyptians who were always good at counterterrorism in their own terms, but actually then feeling forced effectively, you know, or moral persuasion that they had to be more active in collaboration with the international community, helping the Americans, helping the Brits, etc. So partnerships are going to be another big part of that. Technology partnerships, focus. I think probably breaking down silos as well. One of the things that's a little troubling as a former official is that people still haven't been able to figure out how to separate the regional from the global. So, you know, you might see yourself as a CT expert, or you might see yourself as an Afghanistan expert, or a, you know, Horn of Africa expert, or whatever it might be. And it's building the proper synergies between those expertises that, again, can add to the efficiency. So there's no reason why this has to lead to a failure of counterterrorism, but it does require us to be smarter.
Good. This is a bit of a jump from that topic, and I want to ask one more question and open it up to the audience. But I think there are probably more divisions within the Taliban government that are visible from the outside. If there was a split between sort of the three major actors, do you think they would all sort of have the same attitude with regard to safe haven and the possibility of allowing, you know, attacks to be launched from there or bringing foreign fighters there? Or do you think that's one of the things that would be different among the various actors?
That's a really great question. I swear I really wish we had General Sadat here to help me field that one. But so I mean, I think you're referring to Hibatullah as the emir of the Taliban, to Sirajuddin Haqqani as the Haqqani network and the interior minister,
right.
and Mullah Omar's son Yaqub, who's the Minister of Defense.
That's exactly right.
De facto Minister of Defense.
And I got updated on that recently by one of my great students and working students who's an Afghan.
So this is a point on which Afghan experts, interestingly, do disagree with each other. And I still talk to a lot of really serious Afghan experts, and I'm still baffled by how differently they see this. There is a narrative which I find fairly persuasive. The structure of the Taliban, the way it's governed, and the authority that is vested in the supreme leader is so great that in the end he's the only one who matters. And that if anybody else, including Siraj and including Yaqub, actually did something that was seriously disloyal to his authority, that they would be swept away. And that's a fairly common view amongst Afghan experts. But Siraj is a smart guy, and
Is there a religious element of that, because he's is it?
yes, the religious
legitimacy?
authority. Yeah.
It's not the strategy or effectiveness in governing, it's your religious authority.
So this is one of the hardest things to deal with in parts of that region. And we face something the same about Iran, where you have the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the authority. You know, nobody's going to say you're wrong. Nobody's going to say, don't do what he says, do what I say. But of course, if you have a religious authority, religious stroke political authority, but they sit back and they don't really want to be a sort of a dynamic leader, what that creates is an enormous scope for a really smart maneuverer to gain their confidence and then to use their reflected authority to get what they want to do, as long as they don't upset them or cause them to lose face or let them down in some way. And of course, Siraj maybe did rather let Haybatullah down when Zawahiri was found and killed in a Haqqani guest house in Kabul. That was a little bit embarrassing for the Taliban. But in the same way that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Force and Guards Corps, and particularly the Quds Force in Iran, have sort of managed to occupy that space where they have the confidence of the leader and then they have the executive capability to do things. It's possible that Siraj ad-Din Haqqani is smart enough to maintain that position in Afghanistan. And there is some, although he and Yaqub are rivals, my understanding is that whilst Yaqub thinks he might one day become the emir of the Taliban, Siraj has no such ambitions. And so maybe the two of those can help each other to navigate these waters in the space that Haybatullah leads.
Yeah, I mean, I asked that question, I had hidden agenda, because I think that sometimes we build a policy around hope, then we'll have, we'll find the moderate element that we can cut the deal with. Okay, with that, I want to open it up to questions, and I have a strong preference for students or professors on the front row. Go ahead, Jeremy. You go.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Ambassador. I'd like to hear more about how these groups are recruiting. What is it that's drawing individuals to these groups? Are you seeing more recruitment by them? And what can you do about it?
Well, recruitment is certainly more online than in person relative to what the situation was, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And probably COVID accelerated that and moved all of us online to some degree, didn't it? So they do say that the sort of the classic problems that used to arise sometimes in sort of private meetings in extremist mosques in various European or North American cities, that is less where these things are happening. It's more online. But of course, the thing with online is it's also vulnerable. And this is a sort of a perennial dilemma, I think, for the terrorists. And that is that they're technology curious, and they're sometimes very technology people, but they also find that technology can fight both ways. And it's been interesting to see how some of the terrorist groups have got themselves into a complete sort of IT funk. At one point, QAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was basically binning its cell phones because they were just kept being geolocated and they were being killed in counterterrorism operations. And of course, we've just seen in Lebanon an extraordinary pager and walkie-talkie operation, and this can apply also online, and it applies with a whole range of technologies. Because again, one of the things that the UN is quite interesting on this, because the UN gets involved in a lot of discussions about governance of new technology, and that conversation exists in the wider internet, where you've got discussions about how do you have a responsible internet, but how do you avoid going down the sort of the totalitarian route, which is asked for by Russia and China, and you kill the baby with the bathwater, because if you have no creativity, no freedom online, well, like all technologies, it's an overwhelming benefit to have that freedom, but you have to have sensible regulation in order to deal with the problems that arise around the outside. Same thing in the UN with discussions about conventions controlling drone technology. Sort of remotely piloted aerial systems, or indeed actually some at sea as well, which Houthis have got their hands on. So again, drones do far more good than harm. Incredibly important enablers in all sorts of fields of government and service provision. But you have to look at whether they're being adapted for ill. And same with financial technologies. Again, people talk about crypto, or they talk about smartphone money movements and things of that kind. Again, it's important to remember that it's overwhelmingly a force for good, but you also want to be aware of when it's being used for ill. So that's a sort of general technology point. And I think yes, I think most of the recruitment's happening online. And the worry here is that if we're talking about inspired attacks, which at the moment is what we are talking about, that can be entirely online. So if you are just an angry person who's susceptible to the kind of message that ISIS is putting out there about, kill them wherever you find them, one of the phrases that they use. And if you're angry enough, then actually everything that you need is available online. You can find the inspiration, you can find the instructions to construct, some basic mechanism, or just how to run amok with a vehicle or a blade. Of course, again, as I said, that does carry the fact that most of these attacks, where they take place, they're relatively low impact because they're not using high explosives or sophisticated weaponry. And the vast majority of them are spotted and disrupted by the security authorities.
But if you use as example the Tsarnaev brothers in the marathon bombing, I mean they were very much sort of along that model you're describing, and that was not as sophisticated an attack as some of the Al Qaeda could plan, but it was more than just the lone wolf shooter. I wanted to ask, we've talked about these various groups, and in some of these places, if ISIS, was recruiting people out of Europe and they were coming to Iraq and Syria, they declared a caliphate. We talked about this religious element a minute ago, which I think had a big thing to do. But what about the groups that are sort of laid on top of tribal and indigenous issues? I'm specifically thinking about Al-Shabaab and about the groups in, say, Mali or Niger.
Yeah, and of course, in so many places that is the case. You've got a number of motivations, and you get different flavor of. So even if it's an affiliate of a global franchise, it will take on a different character according to where it's happening. This was true in Yemen as well. We actually had during the Yemeni peace process, the very first round of peace talks that I was involved in Geneva. A card-carrying member of Al Qaeda turned up as part of the government delegation. And that was just the Yemeni tribal dynamics. And the government tried to explain to us and to the Americans that this guy was an important tribal figure, and that if you didn't include this person, then you were going to lose quite a significant number of people in Yemen who you needed on the side of the government. But needless to say, the American response was get this guy out of here.
Right.
And you mentioned West Africa, and I think that's really interesting because this is again why I tend to think of Al Qaeda as the greater long-term threat rather than ISIS. It's because they're intelligent and they know how to work with the grain of the societies where they're present. And in that part of West Africa, we're talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, the northern parts of the littoral states of the Gulf of Guinea. There are a number of pre-existing societal faults that exist, for example, between settled farmers and herders. And
say Nigeria, like in the north.
Yeah, exactly. And Al Qaeda is smart enough to plug into that and actually to fix in on the grievances that already exist and work with them. And meanwhile, the governments in places like Bamako and Ouagadougou are not that smart. They're dumb enough to to start working with to have multiple coup d'état, to start working with Russian mercenaries and things like that, thinking that they'll be able to crush Al Qaeda with the help of their Russian or sometimes Iranian friends. And actually, what's going to happen is that they will be increasingly confined to the capital city, looking after themselves, using the mercenaries.
The Russians become a Praetorian Guard versus a counterterrorism.
Exactly.
I mean, for those who don't know, the Russians recently lost a battle. I think I have a question up here about that. Let me see if I can get to it. Aria?
Yeah, so in Professor Pope's class, we work on accounts. One of my accounts is, or my account is Russian Foreign Affairs in Africa. And I've been writing a lot about Mali in specific. So in these places where we're seeing centers and bases of counterterrorism kind of be deposed and Russia or China come in, how grave of a threat do you think those regional actors are going to pose to places like the United States or towards like a larger, more existential threat?
Yeah, so I use that sound bite that what goes on in the conflict zone doesn't stay in the conflict zone, and I do believe that. I'm pretty sure that's true. There's a lead time involved, of course, and so this is one of the problems. And again, it's partly, you're a busy statesperson or politician, and you're saying, is this going to bite me in the next 2 years? Probably not. But, if you were being more visionary and thinking about your legacy, you might say, well, is this going to come and bite us in the next 10 years? Probably yes. And so I think that's part of the issue. So that, the place that you're focused on and the region you're focused on, I think is incredibly interesting for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons is that there are so many fragile jurisdictions in that part of the world. These are countries that are struggling to get by. They're struggling with governance. They're struggling with service delivery. They're certainly struggling with anything like human rights. And they can very easily lose the confidence of people who are not sort of within their inner circle and sort of the direct beneficiaries of them being in power. And we've seen coups in Mali, Faso, Niger, of course. This has been, I referred to the United Nations being dysfunctional. One of the things that has happened to the United Nations very recently is it's increasingly just being thrown out of places. Been thrown out of Mali. The Iraqis have said they want UNAMI gone next year, and the United Nations doesn't do a good job of working with local sensitivities. It tends to be very preachy, and so you then get local people who say, "I don't want to be told what to do by the UN. I don't want to be told about sort of Western progressive values that I don't find particularly relevant to my work." You've then got another factor in this, and this is the sort of the French post-colonial legacy, where France has had a problematic sort of wind down from its colonial era. It's been very domineering in places where it's remained present in West Africa, and that's come home to roost within the last couple of years. So France also has been sort of pushed out. The United States pushed out of Niger, and what's going to happen, I think, here is that you're going to get these coup governments that will increasingly rely on people who don't ask questions, but their record in government and their service delivery to their populations will get worse and worse, and they will probably become unstable. There'll be further coups, and probably ultimately either a coup will accommodate the terrorist groups, or the terrorist groups will simply take over, and you'll end up with the Al-Qaeda coalition running Mali or running Burkina Faso. Now, the question is, what's the lead time from that to something going bang on the streets of Paris or on the streets of New York? And that's a difficult one to calculate, but essentially, I think we can say on the basis of history, that once a terrorist group has got an established safe haven in a failed state, it's usually only a few years before they start saying, this isn't getting us the attention that we want. What we really need to do is to get the attention of the outside world, and we only do that if we manage to make something go bang in a non-conflict zone. So yeah, maybe not in 2 years, but in a lot less than 10 years.
Before I take the next question, I'll just mention another thing that's way too detailed to talk about today, and that is the overlay of some of these places with extremely important minerals and economic motivations by outside actors. Yes, sir.
Terrorism acts against the West, Europe, the United States, result in the deaths of hundreds to thousands of people, but the toll could be a lot higher. At this transition phase, ISIS and others are planning, and they're propaganda, recruiting, and they're teaching hate of the West. When there was that terrorist attack in Moscow, we heard that the CIA had warned the Russians that this was going to happen, and the Russians ignored them until they found out it was true. The elephant in the room is nuclear. To what extent is there cooperation among great powers together to prevent the terrorist groups any one of them to get a hold of a nuclear weapon and achieve much greater threats and damage and death.
So if I may, I would probably want to extend that thought beyond nuclear to the whole CBRN range, because, you know, weapons of mass destruction, whether it's nuclear, whether it's chemical, whether it's biological, these are all relevant in this area. And it's interesting that this has been the nightmare scenario really ever since the Tokyo attack. You know, where people said, "Oh my goodness, if that happens, if a terrorist group were able to deliver a non-conventional weapon, then both the scale of casualties and also the scale of terror would be on a scale, you know, something we haven't seen before." And it is extraordinary, but it hasn't gone further than it has. You know, I would have expected from that time that before 2024, something much bigger of that kind would have happened. And of course, because ISIS was defeated in Iraq and Syria, and we were then able to study the detailed doings and thinkings of the caliphate, we see that they were actively working on this, because they, of course, they controlled, you know, a pseudo state. They controlled universities, they controlled research installations, and they were actively working on weapons of mass destruction for terrorism purposes. Strangely, and it hasn't yet happened, there is a committee in the United Nations, the 1540 Committee, which deals with the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the context of the terrorist threat. Doesn't have a lot of work to do, because actually again, this is the dog that hasn't quite barked yet. But I think if we were to be complacent about it, we would be very foolish indeed.
Yeah, I think this might be one of our last questions. Can you give us?
As the world gets more interested in world power conflict, if a global war were to go, I guess what would be ISK or Al Qaeda's response to that? Would it be sit back and watch, make moves in the region, or get it from where
I think, you know, in the most probable scenario for escalation into a greater state of conflict than we already have, that scenario is probably in the Middle East. So, you know, I mean, I want, for the moment, let's leave aside, you know, issues like Ukraine or Taiwan or anything like that. But, you know, we have a state of hostilities already existing between Israel and Iran, Israel and parts of Lebanon, and you know, sort of militias in Iraq and things of that kind. And the possibility that that escalates into some kind of regional conflict is obviously pretty high. And I think that's most relevant to your question. There, I think, in the case of ISIS, they will be opportunist about it, as they always are. I mean, ISIS is essentially an opportunist, you know, sort of reckless, sort of death cult. They want to kill people, and anything that gives them an opportunity to kill people, they'll take it. They don't care who those people are. They have no sort of no inhibition about killing civilians, children, or anyone else. With Al Qaeda, they're much more strategic, and the really interesting development, as I said, of the last couple of years has been this rapprochement between Al Qaeda and Iran. In fact, that Saif al-Adel sitting in Tehran seems to be increasingly associating Al Qaeda with the Axis of Resistance, and that's where I think your question gets really interesting, because I think if you imagine a scenario where not just Israel, but potentially the US and the US allies are in a state of more open conflict because the Iranians have pushed beyond a certain point and provoked the United States to become a more active participant in the defense of Israel. I think then Al Qaeda would be able to operate with the facilitation of Iranian intelligence capabilities around the world, and that would certainly increase the threat.
Maybe one more. Yes, sir.
So I used to work for an organization that you might be familiar with, William Foundation.
Yes.
And a big part of what we did, you know, was we focused on the connection between Islamist ideology and jihadism, and essentially that jihadism was the violent manifestation of political Islam. And I guess how important do you see that connection? And insofar as you see that it's important, how do we combat the ideology of political Islam in a way that might be different from combating jihadism?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And yeah, I'm familiar with William's work in that area, and one of my closest friends in the UK system is Sir John Jenkins, who was a great expert in that field. There's policy recommendations for the British government on the extent to which so-called non-violent Islamism represents a long-term threat of either subversion or to our international security. One of the reasons I think that there's, one of the things I enjoyed doing in the paper, and of course the topic of this talk has been, the jihadi threat, but I've deliberately gone around the edges of that and talked about the potential overlap with the axis of resistance. And I think there is another interesting thread, which is the one you're referring to of political Islam. And I think what has happened is that the 7th of October attack by Hamas has led to much more of an outbreak of hostility on the streets of Western cities to Western values. And some of that has been, I don't mean to oversimplify this, it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to feel strongly about disproportionate force in Gaza or things of that kind, and I don't want to make any judgment in that area. But it is clear that also a lot of that activity has been stirred up by foreign actors, and quite a lot of it has very quickly overlapped with the more generalized hostilities of the West. So once the Houthis started attacking ships in the Red Sea, you then got Houthi flags as well as Hamas flags or Palestine flags in some of the demonstrations. And you also got sort of the Lebanese Hezbollah flags now starting to appear in a lot of these places as well, where that's legal. In some places it's not legal to show those. What I think has happened is that the general tolerance of significant parts of Western societies to either Western activity in the Middle East or indeed to any Israeli military activity against people who are opposed to Israel. That tolerance in the West has been progressively degraded by the quiet work of political Islam by the Muslim Brotherhood and other related groups. And I think it will be necessary, because this is what's spilling over so clearly into hate speech and also violent hate, as in Amsterdam the other day. I think it is going to necessitate policy reviews throughout the Western world about how to manage the new balance, if you like, between freedom of expression and incitement.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting place for us to be wrapping up here, but I would not dwell on it for 1 second, and which is that this is a bigger dilemma in the West than it is in other places, because we have freedom of speech and we have values that we care about. But if I could I started by saying that I wrote down some things after 9/11, and one of the 5 guiding strategies that I wrote down for myself was avoid at all costs this becoming a war on Islam or being perceived as a war on Islam. So there's a dual-edged line we're walking here, not only on civil liberties, but also on our, what we look like to the world, that we have to be very careful about. And, but I just want to leave this picture of somebody in supposedly a peaceful protest carrying a Houthi flag. And I want to put you on the spot and ask you if you can translate from Arabic what that Houthi flag says.
Yeah. So, God is the greatest. Death to America, death to Israel, shame on the Jews, or a curse on the Jews, and victory to Islam.
So
Says it all.
that's what we're dealing with here. And with that, I think I'm going to have to bring this to an end and thank our guest. Thank you.